All right, thanks. Glad to see everyone here. One of the privileges, or you may think differently after I'm done, of being the main sponsor of Metrics is that whether or not I have anything good to say, they had to let me speak. So we'll see whether that turns out. There we go. Two topics I wanted to cover today related to FDA and the use of data in clinical trials, around the theme of coming up with actionable proposals, relate first to misconduct that's found in clinical trials, and the second is access to clinical trial data. All right, so this is inspired by an article that came out earlier this year in JAMA Internal Medicine by Charles Seif, research misconduct identified by the US Food and Drug Administration. So what he did was that he and some research assistants looked at FDA inspections of clinical trials over roughly a 15-year period. They found 57 clinical trials with FDA citations of significant problems, like falsification of data, non-compliance with the protocol, misreporting of adverse events, pretty significant problems. And out of 78 publications that have been published on these 57 clinical trials, only 3 of them mentioned these significant problems, right? So I could say it's partly the FDA's fault or the FDA lawyer's fault. Perhaps I should make that distinction. So Seif and his research assistants had originally looked at some 600 clinical trials that had failed an inspection in some regard. And there were so many redactions, and that's why I point to the lawyers, that they could only identify the relevant clinical trials in about 15% of the cases. So again, they discovered all these publications that were lacking any sort of acknowledgement of these significant problems like falsification of data, and even so, they were missing 85% of the cases that they suspect were out there. And I think it's not only the FDA's fault. I mean, the investigators and authors, they presumably are aware of the FDA citation. They could have admitted to the problems. The journals themselves perhaps should put a little effort into checking the FDA databases of inspection reports or warning letters. And there's just such a huge disconnect here between the information that the FDA has and the information that the rest of the world has. I think journals could solve this problem overnight if they instituted as what I would call a death penalty for authors who don't disclose that the FDA found a significant problem with their clinical trial. So the journal could occasionally send out some interns to look at these warning letters and could tell authors, look, if we find falsification, non-compliance with protocol, one of these significant problems, you will never publish in this journal ever again. I think that would have some immediate ramifications. So problem number 2, patient-level data from clinical trials. So as we're all aware, there are many, many examples. A couple of recent prominent ones are Study 329 in Paxil, the Tamiflu example. Many cases where when some intrepid investigator is able to dig into the data behind various clinical trials, they find that the effects that have been reported in the literature are not nearly as sizable as has been reported. And so, the true effects or the true side effects are rather different. And I should point out that oftentimes it looks like the FDA actually did a good job. So I'm not pointing the finger at the FDA here. The FDA often does a good job at analyzing all of this evidence, figuring out what are the side effects, what are the true effects. It's just that information doesn't get out to the rest of the world, to the published literature, to the guidelines, even to other federal agencies. So the CDC, I think, to this day recommends certain effectiveness of Tamiflu that isn't really justified by the full spectrum of clinical trials. So the FDA is sitting on this treasure trove of data. Why isn't there a way to make it available to independent researchers to go in and see whether what gets out to the published literature and to guidelines, et cetera, is actually consistent with what the FDA has collected? And so I would point to FOIA and the exception for commercial and confidential information. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Freedom of Information Act in the United States requires government agencies to release records on request. And there's an exemption to that for trade secrets, commercial and financial information, or privileged and confidential information. And so the FDA has traditionally interpreted clinical trial safety and effectiveness data to be commercially confidential. And so I wanted to give one example here that I found kind of jaw-dropping. So there's this drug called Truvada. It's prophylaxis for HIV. It's approved in July a couple years ago. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation was worried about side effects and effectiveness data. So they wanted to get the data from FDA, and they weren't successful, so they sued under FOIA in federal court in California. So this may be a little hard to read, and I won't read all of it, but Gilead's vice president for regulatory affairs submitted some testimony in federal court that said you have to keep this effectiveness and safety data confidential, not just to protect the data, but to protect the statistical methods they use to analyze the data. He says that the application of statistical methodologies to support applications for FDA approval is complex and would reveal to competitors insights that Gilead has developed. They say if other pharmaceutical companies could obtain access to this information, they would be able to adapt the techniques and methodologies to pursue approvals for their products, thereby causing Gilead significant competitive harm. He goes on to say that although the top-line results of these clinical trials have been published in scientific journals and openly discussed at research conferences, Gilead's detailed analyses of those data remain confidential. They include extensive unpublished discussions of the statistical methods Gilead used to analyze the voluminous raw data. Gilead has not disclosed this information publicly. Gilead obtained this proprietary information through substantial investment and submitted it to FDA with the expectation that it would remain confidential. And here, when he said the expectation is that statistical methods would remain confidential, he cited a particular federal regulation which says the following data and information are not available for disclosure: quantitative or semi-quantitative formulas. Now the thing is that actual citation, that occurs at the end of a list of other things like commercial success or sales figures or manufacturing processes. So clearly it refers to some sort of quantitative information about how the drug is actually made. I don't think it could possibly refer to the statistical methods for analyzing patient-level data. So I think that the notion that statistical methods, like a t-test, of means across different groups, that kind of thing, cannot be confidential. Statistical methods cannot possibly be proprietary. And that's like saying that you've patented the quadratic formula. It's like saying that you own the idea of eigenvectors, or it's like saying that you own Gauss's method for adding up the numbers 1 through n. It's even like saying you own 2 + 2 = 4. Statistical methods are part of our way of understanding the universe. They don't belong to any one company. So you might think the FDA came riding in to save the day, right, from this ridiculous, ludicrous argument. Not exactly. So here's the FDA's filing in federal court. Again, I would point to the FDA lawyers. I think it's the lawyers who are taking this rather conservative and restrictive position. So the lawyers write that Gilead invested considerable time and effort to develop statistical methods and analyses to transform study data conducted by third-party researchers into a format acceptable to FDA. Public release of this information would reveal the firm's approach and statistical methodology for working with these non-traditional data sets. And you can read the rest. So if you get a slight sense of deja vu when you hear this language, it's because I read it just a couple of minutes ago when I was reading the testimony of the vice president of Gilead. So what the FDA wrote there in federal court is taken nearly verbatim. So my modest suggestion to the FDA is that if a pharma company invents a statistical methodology for dealing with non-traditional data sets, whatever that means, the government agency charged with protecting the public ought not send its lawyers into federal court to be a mouthpiece for the vice president of that company's arguments. Instead, it ought to be all the more vigilant about allowing professional statisticians to exercise some sort of independent scrutiny of these statistical methodologies. So how it all ended, by the way, is that the court order denied the FDA's request and ordered the complete and unredacted release. So my ideal for a proposal, this might be a pie in the sky, is the FDA should build a data enclave where independent researchers could look at every data set from every clinical trial from all time that the FDA has ever possessed. I don't see why that couldn't be the case. How do we get there? Speaking as a lawyer, I think it is mostly due to the lawyers. I think lawyers by nature are very risk averse, and government agency lawyers in particular, when you talk to them about releasing data, their every instinct is to be conservative and restrictive and to say no, because releasing data for them is all downside and no upside. It's only putting the agency at risk. Well, that's not a likely solution. So more likely route is some sort of policy and legal reform. Although I would point out that in 1984, the Hatch-Waxman Act already mandates that the FDA release safety and effectiveness data both for non-approved and abandoned drugs and for approved drugs that have been made subject to generic competition. I don't see that happening, to my knowledge. I might be wrong, but I don't really see that happening. And so I wonder, again, where's the disconnect, or what's the sort of legal analysis by which that portion of the law, that mandate, has been ignored. So those are my ideas as far as the FDA and the disclosure of data.